Welcome to the Stories Told podcast. This is episode 72, Anti-E.T. This is the Stories Told podcast. Two authors talking about stories in movies, TV, and of course, books.
I'm Michael Grayford. I write action-adventure stories in fantasy and sci-fi worlds, sometimes for younger readers and sometimes for adults. And I try to always inject at least a little bit of humor.
And I am author E.W. Barnes, and I write action-adventure, time travel novels, and space opera science fiction. Thousands of years, thousands of worlds. But be forewarned, beyond here, there will be spoilers. Are you ready for the adventure? Let's begin. Welcome back to the Stories Told podcast. I'm author E.W. Barnes, and with me is author Michael Grayford. And today we're talking about the story told in the 1996 film, Independence Day. How you doing today, Mike?
I am doing great, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great as well, thank you. And what's new in your writing world?
New in my writing world, nothing new. I am just eking my way through feedback from my alpha draft of Zara 2, and then just, business stuff, playing with ads and things like that. But otherwise, nothing too exciting. What's going on in your writing world?
Well, as you're aware, I've finished the main writing of Ecliptic, and so I've started working on the plotting for the next book in the Adventures of the Empyrean Guard series. That book is called Meridian. And so I've been doing a lot of studying and evaluating what kind of plot points I want to have in place. I already have sort of key moments that I want to take place in the story, but I want to also then, how am I going to get to those moments and what is that plotting going to look like? So I've been working on that process this week. The goal is I'm hoping to start writing next week, which will be the beginning of July. And so the next time we talk, I'm hoping that I will have several thousand words under my belt.
Wow, that's fantastic. So you jump right into the next one.
Yeah.
Do you have an editing process for the previous one?
It's funny that you should say that. I should, but I'm not. And the reason I'm not is because for me, this series is one great big story that I've divided him up into 5 pieces. And so I'm actually going back as I'm plotting Meridian. I'm actually going back and modifying things in Ecliptic just so that I have a little bit more of a tie-in for where I want to go in Meridian. So I probably should start editing at some point, but right now I'm sort of in the mode of doing the plotting for Meridian. So I'm just going to keep doing that because that's where my head is. And then I'll go back and edit Ecliptic. My goal is to actually release these one after the other, like every 4 weeks. And so it's not critical that I edit right now as far as like the grammar and, making sure I don't have any typos right now. That piece is not critical to me. It's more critical to make sure that the story is all connecting the way it needs to. I will have to go in and do some, significant editing for that down the road. Yes.
That makes sense.
There will be much editing down the road. And what I'll do for that is, of course, I have programs for that. There are some really wonderful editing programs. I personally use ProWriting Aid. That's the one that I like to do. And then I will also listen to it. I'll do a text-to-speech, probably just the one that's available through Word. And I'll listen to it because that helps me catch stuff too. For example, I like to catch if I've used a word too many times in a very short space. I want to switch up a word so that that repetition kind of will take me out of the story. So I'll switch up words. I'll find stuff that ProWriting Aid won't necessarily find. So I'll do that. And then, of course, I have humans look at it as well.
Perfect. Yeah, no, that's great.
So as a reminder to our listeners, you can read The Adventures of the Empyrean Guard as it's being written on Patreon, and that's at the Galactic Heroes level on my Patreon page. And you can also read The Tales of Zara on Amazon in both episodic format on Kindle Vella, as well as ebook and paperback. And you can also read The Deep Dark, which is Mike's adult science fiction story, and that is available on Kindle Vella in episodic format, and all those links will be in the show notes. What interesting stories have you come across lately in books, movies, or television?
Let's see, I just finished the season finale for the Apple TV Plus show Dark Matter, which is a show created by the person who wrote the book. So I assume it sticks fairly closely to what's in the book, given that he did both. Yeah, it's a sci-fi show, without giving too much away, about this guy who's created this device to let him go between different universes. It's a multiverse type story. Initially, it starts off kind of like standard fare, like, oh, I've seen this story 100 times before by now. But then it throws in some twists and some good character stuff, and some interesting world stuff that happens later on in the series. Once you get past the first couple episodes, it starts getting into there. So it's an interesting view. Definitely a hard sci-fi type thing. And other than that, I think that's it. What about you? What have you read or watched in the last week or so?
Well, Dark Matter sounds really interesting. I think I might want to check that out. So we'll give that a look, see if we like it too. I am actually still reading the Stormlight Archive. I read it very slowly, in addition to the books that we are reading for the podcast. So, those are the books that we read. And then when I'm not reading for the podcast, I'll go back to the Stormlight Archive and read that.
Yeah.
As far as television, I've been kind of watching an eclectic mix of stuff, having some fun with some of the movies that are available on Disney. Rewatched Monsters, Inc., which
Excellent.
was fun. And it was another Pixar film that I rewatched. I can't remember which one it was. Oh, it was The Incredibles. Well, also a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah. Those are good.
It's just amazing how well these stories hold up. Going back and watching them again. They're really well-written stories. Night at the Museum. Forgot how much fun that was.
Oh, yeah. I love those movies. They're really fun.
Yeah, so that was a lot of fun. So that's kind of it. Cool. So before we move on to talking about Independence Day, I wanted to say a big thank you to those folks who commented on last week's podcast on Andor. We got some really good comments, and I am absolutely delighted that, Andor is such a great series, and it's nice to see that there are other people who are invested in this really good television series and that they gave us their comments on that podcast. I was really pleased.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I feel the same. I'm glad people are interested and felt like they could comment, and hopefully more people will chime in.
Yeah. So are you ready to talk about Independence Day?
Oh, yeah. Let's do it.
Today we're talking about the story told in the 1996 film Independence Day. And not coincidentally, this podcast will be released on the 4th of July weekend in 2024. Yes, we did that on purpose. Yes, we realize that's hokey, and we're having fun with it. So I'm going to read the synopsis for Independence Day that you can find on IMDb. The aliens are coming, and their goal is to invade and destroy Earth. Fighting superior technology, mankind's best weapon is the will to survive. Did you like this movie?
Yeah, I really like this movie. I saw this on opening night when it was first released, and there was a lot of hype built up around the movie at the time. Well, we didn't really know exactly what it was about. The previews, from what I remember, were fairly sparse, sort of like The Matrix. It's like, okay, it's just hype generating, but other than aliens are coming, you don't know too much of what happens in the movie. And I loved it. I thought it blew me away. I mean, it's hard to say to people, now who maybe would see it in the world of, modern special effects and blockbusters that we have these days. But at the time, this just blew me away, and I think blew a lot of people away. Story-wise, I think it has a lot of good elements. Of course, it's a science fiction story with, an alien invasion, an alien attack, but it also has some really great moments of humor, amazing action, an epic scale, even a touch of horror thrown in there. So there's a lot going on in the script, and I think it overall still holds up pretty well for me. And it does something that is, I think, tough to pull off, and not a lot of movies carry it through as well as this one did, which is giving you a sense of such a satisfying victory at the end of the story. I think that's one of the reasons that Star Wars worked so well, right? It's like you have that climactic moment at the end where it's like the odds are built up against you. It's seemingly impossible, and the good guys carry the day, and you're just left with this euphoric feeling at the end. And I think Independence Day did that really well also. You leave the theater feeling like this was a major accomplishment, against these ridiculous odds. And I loved all the references to other things, other movies, and things like that. Like the music, it starts off with, it's the end of the world as we know it.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, it just sets the tone. You're like, you know what you're getting now. As soon as the movie starts, like, okay, I see where this is going. And then, they show the day the Earth stood still on TV.
Yes.
And then Will Smith's pilot friend saying, I can't shake him. It's like with an obvious nod to Star Wars. The must go faster line by Jeff Goldblum from Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
And obviously the whole movie is a modern take on War of the Worlds, right? They clearly read War of the Worlds and said, okay, let's do a modern version of this and fix the ending. Because I don't know if you ever read the War of the Worlds book or saw the old movies or the radio drama or whatever.
I've read the H.G. Wells.
Yeah, me too. I read the H.G. Wells.
Yeah.
And it's a very enjoyable story, and then it just ends. Like H.G. Wells is great at coming up with good ideas and bad at wrapping up his stories in a satisfying way. I think it was an interesting idea at the time where, these aliens come and the virus just kind of kills them off, but that is just so unsatisfying from a storytelling perspective, especially these days. Maybe then it was kind of cool, but now it's just like, okay, so the good guy, the people did nothing, and they defeated the aliens. That was super lame to me. So I thought they did a really clever take on that in Independence Day by making it a virus. That's the thing that defeats them, but it's a computer virus that humans have to make, and they have to get it onto the mothership, which infects them. I thought that was really clever. I like that twist, and it makes it feel so much more agentive for the characters than just watching the enemy die. So I applaud that decision on the writer's parts. And I like that it gets you right up from the start, right? It hooks you right from the very beginning with the alien ship coming in over the moon. You know it's coming, right? They don't drag it out. It's like, oh, here we go. And I think that helps set up the steady increase of tension throughout the first act. And we get the build up as the alien ships arrive in the atmosphere, this cool visual effect that we've never seen before, of like burning the sky as it's coming through is really cool. And then just everything leading up to the ultimate act of destruction with, I think Jeff Goldblum's character plays that part really well, where he figures out what's going on, and any hope of, hey, we're going to talk to these aliens and, figure out what's going on. Again, they set it up pretty early that they're not here for that. They're here to destroy. And they're not really interested in any kind of talk or discussion. So we know it's coming. And that is something we saw in the preview. We see, okay, there's going to be an attack. And so it's just this tension that builds as characters start fleeing, the helicopters get destroyed. It's just like more and more happens where like this sense of inevitable destruction that's coming. I thought they did that so well. And then, of course, it's just such a satisfying payoff when it finally happens. And you just see the blasts from these alien ships just destroying buildings and destroying the cities, and streets are on fire and cars are going flying. Again, this isn't something you can appreciate today as much because you've seen effects, at this scale before. But at the time, it was just mind-blowing watching this happen and see what they can pull off. It was something unlike anything we'd seen before. But that's less story and more, the audio visual aspects of the medium. And it made me wonder if it would have worked as well as a novel. Like, yeah, you can see things in your head, but the way that they brought it to life, it was just phenomenal. I thought the build up and payoff in that first act was just brilliant. And then when we were watching it in the theater, when the destruction ends and Jasmine makes it into the side passageway and the screen fades to black and then July 3rd appears, the crowd just went nuts. Everybody was applauding. It was just such a cool moment to be a part of. Obviously, it's, you don't get quite the impact these days with that, certainly when you're watching it at home on your TV. But I still thought that played off very well for me. It engaged me to where I was like totally into the story again. So I thought that worked really well. And then overall, I think this movie is kind of like the Anti-E.T, right? Given that we had just talked about that recently. E.T. was sort of this warm, close movie about this friendly, scared alien that's slowly dying because he's missing his people, and this one family that's trying to help him out. And this is like the opposite. This is the aliens are here en masse to destroy the planet or to destroy humanity and, ravage the planet for resources. So it's very much the opposite of E.T. And they referenced E.T., I think, in the movie too, if I remember right. Yeah, and I liked, we always talk about humor. I liked that there was humor in the story, but I also think they were smart in that it wasn't like Will Smith joking the whole movie. It's like he had his little shtick as his character. He was sort of this, guy of great bravado and lots of quips, but that was his thing. Everyone else wasn't that way, and they allowed the story to be a little more serious at times and with different characters, with more judicious humor thrown in during those other moments. And I thought it played very well. I thought that still held up for me for the most part. And throughout it all, even though it's this epic story, I do feel that they managed to still maintain some of the personal effect, right? Some of the human element, the relationships in this otherwise worldwide conflict. I thought that was good because it could have gotten completely overshadowed, and I don't think that it did. And I think this is we talked about underdog stories before, right? I think this is like one of those ultimate underdog stories where how are we going to defeat these things? They have ships the size of entire cities coming, and they just blasted you, and they've got these shields that you can't get through, and they're all over the world. We shoot nukes at them, nothing happens. They do a good job of building the enemy up to be so powerful that like you just feel like you can't be defeated. And then there's that glimmer of hope of like, well, maybe we can do this. So I thought they played that off really well. But it's sort of like an ultimate underdog story, and I think that's another reason that it resonates people. We get the rousing speech from the president at the end, which sort of exemplifies that feeling. And then when they pull it off, it feels great. So, yes, I loved this movie then, and I still think it held up pretty well for me today. What do you think? What aspects of this movie do you like?
There's several aspects that I like about this movie. And one of the things and I don't think you mentioned it this time, I apologize if I missed it, but it's the ensemble piece that we enjoy, where the problem is
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
Really like that. And like you said, I really appreciated the point that you raised about how there's payoff in the middle as well as at the end, which I think is a great storytelling technique. I mean, you get people, the tension, like you said, rising tension, and then bam, you've got your, moment everything changes. And then you have another then rising tension to a new payoff at the end. And I think that was very well done, very well written storytelling right there. But the thing that I really love most about this movie is at the beginning of the movie, we are introduced to a series of different people in different situations in very short order. It's like bam, 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 bam. We get taken to different places. But there is a connecting link between each one of them that I think is absolutely brilliant. We start off with the spaceship coming over the moon, like you said. And then we go right to SETI, who, of course, are the people who scan the skies for extraterrestrial life. So we have the evidence of extraterrestrial life, and then we go to SETI. And the SETI folks talk about, could it be military? And they're like, no, it's not military. But our next scene is the military. Talking about the SETI folks don't know what this is either. And then the military talk about the satellites, right? And then the next scene is the satellites are being interfered with for cable television. And then the next scene is these kids watching cable television and they can't get the picture because of satellites. Every single one is like linked from the previous scene, and it weaves a coherent thread throughout, even though we're going to different places and meeting different people in a very short period of time.
That's great. I didn't even
really
catch
well
that.
done. It's amazing when you go back and watch it. There's something in each scene that relates to the next scene that carries you along. I ran out of I lost track of how many scenes because I started getting really involved in the movie, which is a sign that it's a really good storytelling because I'm not paying attention to it anymore as a story. I'm paying attention to it as a story that I'm engaged in as opposed to a story that I'm analyzing. And I think that's a really great sign. That's a good story. Yeah, that's probably my favorite thing, is just watching these links one after the other as they introduce us to all these characters. I love how we talked about how they all have to solve the problem together. As a species, we had to solve the problem together. So it's not just, the pilot and the computer genius, but it's also the military pilots. It's also the folks all around the world being available and ready to join together to take down the aliens. It's global collaboration that solves the problem. And I love how you start really small with just the individuals, and then it spreads out to the entire world. I think that's exciting. And I think that contributes to that payoff, as you were talking about. This wouldn't be as nearly a good ending if it was just the Americans taking down the spaceship over Area 51. The fact that it happens all over the world is part of that really satisfying end. So this is a fun movie overall, but is there anything that you might have changed as a writer?
Yeah, there were some things that popped out to me this time watching it through, and there's probably a lot more if I really analyzed it. Well, let's go with the things that I just noticed quickly. I think there were a couple of coincidences that seemed hard to swallow. Like Jasmine just happens to find the first lady in the crashed helicopter. So it's like this one character who's related to this other character, but not at all related to the first lady. Just happens to run into the first lady, who's connected obviously to the president, who's now working with the Will Smith character. That seemed a little bit too coincidental. That said, the movie's already 2.5 hours long. You don't want to add too much more connective tissue. You just kind of want to get on with the story. So I can see why they did that for convenience. And likewise, when the Will Smith character goes to find his girlfriend, to be fiance, and just like immediately finds her. Oh, there she is, right there. Like, what? He didn't have to look for her at all. He just shows up and he's there. So those two things right there really seemed awfully convenient to me. And then another thing I noticed at the end of day one, when Jasmine is fleeing with her son and dog in the car, and then she gets out of the car, and then we see the destruction coming up the street toward them, and she jumps into the room. Like, she would be dead. That was just ridiculously implausible. There's not really any barrier between what's going on out there and her. At least if the door had been closed, it would be a little bit more viable. So I would have at least done that, or had them like jump into a storm drain into some water underground or something, because that was just kind of ridiculous that they survived that. Small thing, did not take away from my enjoyment from the movie in the least, but I would have done it differently. And then as the movie progressed in the latter acts, I would have shown more cities around the world being destroyed, or at least mentioning them to remind us that there's a countdown to extermination. They kind of mentioned that, like, oh, this is going to be done, the whole world's going to be done in like 12 hours or 30. I forget what the amount of time was. Like, they had, very, very short
36.
period of time. What was it? 36 hours. Yeah. So 36 hours. I would have liked to have seen the build up toward that. Like, oh, now, Rome has fallen, and, whatever. If you want to keep it to just America, Detroit has fallen, show us the progression. We know it. Obviously, we've seen what they can do, and it's in the back of our mind. But having it mentioned, like, oh, there goes another city, there goes another city, and just seeing like the world is being destroyed. I think they could have done that with just a few sentences scattered throughout the latter acts. So I would have put that in there just to kind of remind the viewer of, the stakes, as if we needed reminding, I guess. But that's something I'd like to do in my writing, is kind of remind people like what's at stake, where are we going, and the deadline is coming close. I would have liked to have seen at least one scene of the Goldblum character working on learning the operating system of the alien computers. It just seemed awfully quick, like, oh, here's this idea for a virus. Okay, we made it, and now we're uploading it. It's kind of hard to swallow that as it is, but at least having them figure it out, like, oh, we figured it out. Here's what they're doing. Just one more little tiny scene I would put in there. Again, not a huge thing. I wouldn't want it to interrupt the flow of the movie, but it was a little hard to believe. And then the rousing speech by the president. I thought that I really enjoyed that speech. I thought, Bill Pullman delivered it really well. But this time when I was watching it, the line about this is our Independence Day, it didn't really make sense. It's like independence isn't really the right word there. It's more like it's your Salvation Day or something. I get that, like, that's the name of the movie. And I was reading about this after I watched it, an interview with these guys, and he threw that in at literally like the last minute, the day they were shooting it, because apparently the studio Fox wanted to change the name of the movie.
Oh.
And so they threw that line in to like help cement it as this is Independence Day, because that's what they really wanted to be called, Independence Day, and they wanted to release it on July 4th. So that's part of the reason they threw that line in. So I thought that was kind of funny. But I think they could have made that speech just as rousing without that kind of weirdness to it. But at the time when I first watched it, I thought it resonated pretty well. So those are the things that kind of just caught me this time watching it through. Most honestly, I think it works fine without those changes, but those are things that I would have done. What about you? What would you have improved?
It's funny. Some of the things that you commented on, for example, the destruction of the cities around the world, I think that's a really great point. I think that would have really kept the intensity of the story going a little bit, because I think there's a bit of a lull after the aliens attack the cities, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So I'm going to go to what you said about Jasmine. Yes, absolutely. I've always thought that was ridiculously implausible that she could go into a closet and then not die. I just don't think fire works that way. But
yeah, she's fine.
But what I think is really the problem, and I know, and there may be people who really disagree here, and that's okay. It's the dog that's the problem. They added that scene of the, having to call the dog. And that was part of the slowdown, why she didn't close the door, right? And or maybe she did close the door, but we didn't see it because we're focused on the dog. Right. And the dog, actually, bless his sweet little heart, ruins the scene, because that is not a scared dog. That's a happy dog that's jumping into the closet because their trainer is calling them with a treat. That's you can see the dog's face. The dog is happy. So I think they could take the dog out, or have the dog with them as they go in the closet, and not have that moment of, oh no, the dog, which is trying to pull on, the audience's heartstrings. Save the dog. If they had taken that out and just pulled the dog in the closet and slammed the closet door, then it would have felt much more realistic, possibly, that they survived that in this concrete room. I agree with you on that, but it's just a small thing. It is such a small thing, but I always laugh whenever I see the dog leaping off the car just before the flames arrive, smiling. It's that very happy dog.
No, I like your suggestion there. I like your thought that I think that would work fine. Like they just, I mean, because we already see the destruction coming. It's like death is imminent. We don't need that extra little bit. Just have them all run in there and then boom,
Yeah.
slam the door, and
No.
that's it.
I
That
will
would have
also
been
say
perfect.
that I did not stream this. I watched this on a DVD that I have, and my DVD actually has it's a special edition version, which had additional scenes that had been cut out that were it's like a director's cut, though
Oh,
it's not called a director's cut. And there is actually a scene of the Jeff Goldblum character learning the operating system, just like you said. He's in, yeah, so
oh,
he's
that's
in the
funny.
spaceship and figuring out how the computer system functions. So yes, that might have been helpful, and they did think of it, so they cut it out for the theatrical release, maybe because it was 2.5 hours long.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, in the interview, they said they were having a tough time
Yeah,
editing it down because they were going through with the editor, and the editor's like, this is kind of important. You need to have this. So that was probably just one of the things where they realized it would be nice to see this, but it wasn't necessary. So maybe they made
yeah.
the right decision on
So,
that.
but that actually kind of goes to my biggest concern with the story, and that is it does feel like the story slows down quite a bit after the destruction of the city, sort of in the aftermath of the attacks. And I found myself sort of getting up and wandering around after that. I was riveted up until that point. And then I would get up and sort of, which meant I wasn't as engaged for some reason. And I think it's because the pace really sort of changes. And I'm not entirely sure how I would have fixed that. Maybe what your point about the ongoing destruction of other cities would have helped keep that energy ramped up. But I think, for example, I think the battle scenes took too long, with the fighter jets. Once you can't get through those shields, you should be done. You're
That's
out,
it. Yeah,
right? And being chased.
that's true. That was another thought I had. It's like, oh, okay, well, this is a failure.
Yeah.
That's it.
I think that they should have been out. And then, the scene with the dog fighting with Will Smith's character and the alien spaceship, I think that took too long. So I think just tightening all that up a little bit to, in the same way that the first part of the film was just bam, 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 bam. Here's all these things that are happening. I think the second part should have been the same thing. Okay, now we've had the explosions, and you're right. The going to black and then saying July 3rd, it's like that was a brilliant sort of dramatic technique to keep people on the edge of their seats, right? You just kind of go like that, you can't even take a breath because it's so fast. I think we kind of lose that pace in the next part of the story. And I would have liked to have seen the same kind of let's just keep it going and wrap it up and wrap it up and wrap it up. But does that mean that this film is not fun and watchable? Absolutely not. It's totally fun. They're just, like I said, I got up and wandered around a little bit because, okay, you can't get through the shields. What are you going to do now? And maybe that's just sort of because of modern storytelling, which is a lot tighter. And back again, when this movie was released, storytelling wasn't quite like that. So this was, cutting edge storytelling at the time.
Yeah, I think you might be right. Because if you look at how they do the setup for the opening act, right, the first day, we get shots, like you said, of the different characters, different locations, and the brilliant threading, as you pointed out, from one scene to the next, from one location to the next, from one group of people to the next, and it slowly builds and builds and builds and builds and builds, and then boom, we get this explosive culmination of destruction, glorious destruction. And then you're right. Then it's like they obviously after that point they have to step back some, but yeah, maybe they could have cranked it up a little bit. I think you don't want to lose the personal element, right, of the characters and the relationships, but maybe tying that into what is happening with the action a little bit more, make them a little bit more hurried and frenzied in their actions and trying to deal with the situation, because it did seem like they were standing around debating and talking what's going on. It kind of reminded me of like Star Trek: The Next Generation reaction to things versus the original Star Trek. Like in the original Star Trek, they're running down the halls, they're trying to figure out what's going on, they're fighting people, whatever. And in Next Generation, they're standing around talking about what to do. So maybe it's a little bit of that.
That's a good thought. So did you find any themes in Independence Day?
Oh, themes. I think. Well, I mean, I think this is a survival story, right? This is disaster kind of storyline where you're trying to get, just literally survive, right? The whole planet is just literally trying to survive with the added element thrown in of, well, we can't just avoid this situation. So it's an interesting take on it, right? It's not just survive this tsunami or survive this earthquake or survive this hurricane. It's we have to do something actively or there will be no survival. So I really like that take on it. And I think that's how it sets itself apart from the source book. So I think looking for a theme, I would say maybe it's something like there's always a way to succeed if you're clever and brave enough. Something like that. If I'm looking past just survival into how do we solve this situation. So that was what I got. What did you come away with it from? Come away with it?
Very similar. I had resilience in the face of destruction. We had these characters who were faced with really traumatic experiences. The destruction of cities, the destruction of the El Toro Marine Base, which, by the way, for those listening, that was not actually El Toro. We have, the president who loses his wife, right? And he's still having to be resilient. And then we have, as a counterpoint to that, we've got the Secretary of Defense, who did not share pertinent information when this started. You would think that would have been important.
Yeah.
And then B, was unwilling to try something new to win, even though it was a bit of a long shot. So he was kind of the counterpoint of how the kind of behavior that actually is portrayed as successful in this movie.
Yeah, he's the antagonist of the story, right? He's luring the heroes away from the correct path by presenting a seemingly reasonable argument that would tempt them into doing what would ultimately have been the wrong thing. That's a good point. Yeah, so you're right. I think that leads us to the theme of being bold, right? Because the president starts off and he's not that way. He's seen as a wimp. He's not, he's not being strong. He's not taking chances. And at the end, it's about making the bold decision. It's about taking that chance, taking that risk, and going all in.
So what do you take away from Independence Day as a writer?
Oh boy, I mean the first thing that smacks me across the face is don't underestimate the value of spectacle. And while this is an audio-visual medium, that doesn't mean you can't create that spectacle in a novel as well. To create worlds and settings and situations and events that are large and exciting and try to spark the reader's imagination. So that was something that hit me first. I also think there's the sort of underdog story of your heroes overcoming just seemingly overwhelming odds. It's such a gratifying thing, right? We've seen this in other stories we've talked about, and I think we really see that here again, and I think that's a huge takeaway. So don't be afraid to stack the odds against your heroes. So that's a takeaway. And then the other one is one that you mentioned, which I have to agree with and bring up again, which is don't be afraid to have a big payoff within the story rather than just at the end, as long as it's not overshadowing, what's to come. You don't want your biggest, best, and most amazing thing to happen, and then the end is just kind of like, okay, yeah, it ended. That wouldn't be satisfying. Yeah. But you can have something big in the middle, as long as you have at least an equal payoff at the end. So those are mine. I have a few takeaways this time. What do you take away from this?
Well, I agree with you with your takeaways, and I would add I would love to figure out how to incorporate into my writing this, as you put it, I like the way you put it, the threading of the scenes in that first half. What would that look like? I mean, because it's easy to sort of, maybe not so easy, I don't know. It was recognizable in this audio visual mode to see the connections because you didn't have there was absolutely no dialogue in the first part, the very first scene. You just see the spaceship and you see the moon and you see the footsteps disappearing because of the vibrations. And then you have dialogue in the next scene, but it's connected. But there's dialogue and not dialogue. So it would be, if it were written, this threading would have to be through description and then dialogue and then description and dialogue. And I'm not sure how obvious it would be as it was in the visual medium. So I'm kind of thinking about that, but that's my takeaway. The challenge of how that threading might look.
Oh yeah, that's a great one.
The written
word. Yeah. I think you could do that with cuts between scenes or even chapters. You end a chapter, then immediately you're somewhere else. And it's maybe not, it's not first apparent that it's like one led into the other, but then as soon as you get into the chapter a little bit, you realize, oh, is this connected to the other thing that they were just talking about? I think you could pull that off. Yeah, that's a good one. I like that.
Thank you for joining us as we talked about the story told in the 1996 film, Independence Day. A big thank you to our Patreon supporters and all our subscribers. We're so grateful for your support and your encouragement. The Stories Told podcast is available on multiple podcast platforms, and we thank you for liking and subscribing or following, depending on where you're listening. It may not be a big deal to you, but it means a lot to us. If you have a favorite book, movie, or TV series that you'd like to suggest for the podcast, leave a comment on the YouTube channel, and that link is in the show notes. You can find Michael Grayford at michaelgrayford.com and E.W. Barnes at 1000years.com, and those links are also in the show notes. Join us next time as we talk about the story told in Dark City. Thanks a lot, Mike. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you.
And we'll see you next time on the Stories Told podcast.